Howdy folks, Faircyclist was here, and welcome to part 3 of West Coast Rail Nerd Reacts, a series where I go through and give additional context to Hyce and kAN's Railroads Online content. Today's episode is about Hyce and kAN building a hump yard in Railroads Online. And as we'll see, that's probably not the greatest idea, and is probably not the most practical idea either. This episode is going to be slightly different than last week's episode, where I tried something different and did a lot of math, and got some pretty interesting results. So if you haven't seen it yet, I recommend that you go check out part 2, because friction bearings are weird. But let's get into today's episode of Hyce and kAN. And another way that this is going to be different is I've actually already watched the episode. In this episode, they spend a lot of time not talking about things that I can give context to. Is they're really trying to figure out how to build a hump yard, where Hyce has previous experience working on one with BNSF, and kAN just knows that it's a funny word and that's what he wants to build. And so they spend a lot of this episode trying to figure out how to build one, and there's not really much that I can comment on. But for the things that I can comment on, I'll just switch to the section that has the footage and give my reaction. So I'll see you at the end of the video.
Oh, the people.
You would be
We're
shocked how quiet they are.
What are we dressed as? We're dressed as conductors?
Yeah, vaguely, kind of, yes.
We're vague conductors?
According to Turbo Squid, this is an Old West train conductor, so.
Okay, interesting. Today we're...
Actually, that's actually pretty close to what it would be. I know that there's a lot to be said about, oh look, it's John Railroadson, and he's sort of vague and generic. You know, he's wearing a black suit with the Colonel Sanders, bow tie, and a cap that's vaguely railroadish. But in the early days of railroading, it was basically whatever people wanted to wear. Railroad companies did have, basic, this is how you should act, this is how you should dress. But especially the narrow gauge railroads didn't have uniforms in the same sense that we think of them today. It was basically whatever was best for you to work in. Quite famously, there's a book for this, a number of books on this. The one that I would recommend is Locomotive and Engineer's Album. Here, let me bring this into larger screen. So Locomotive and Engineer's Album. This book was written in the 1960s to capitalize on this nostalgic wave of everybody going, ooh, what happened in the 1860s? Were there interesting things that happened then? And the answer is yes, there are a lot of interesting things that happened in the 1860s, including, the modern age of American railroading, finally making it from one coast to the other. And so the Transcontinental Railroad gets built in the late 1860s, and then from the 1870s through the 1880s, it just explodes in the terms of, size and scope of American railroading. And this book is full of very pretty pictures with lots of words written underneath the pictures, but not a lot of substance. Again, I sort of mentioned that it was the nostalgic age of railroading because everybody in the 1960s wanted to see what was happening in the 1860s. And, Western films are very popular. The birth of the spaghetti Westerns is either here or in the very near future. And so, everybody's looking to try and recapture in the imagination, this simpler way of living. And so they start producing books like this. There are actually a number of them. I've got a few. Pacific Slope Railroading. This was railroading. Rails West. And all of these are basically produced at the same time in the 1960s, where, you could sell books like this in the hundreds of thousands because people wanted to see railroading back when it was, the only thing around. And that continues for quite a while. But what it means is that these were produced for the general public. They weren't particularly produced for, railroaders or train enthusiasts, as these were really, as fast and quick as you could pump them out, with taking photos from libraries and railroad collections, and then slapping in some context underneath and hoping that people would buy it. But in a locomotive engineers album, quite quite famously, there are pictures of early railroad engineers in full suits driving locomotives, which, talk about the safety hazards and all that other stuff. I would not want to be caught dead wearing an overcoat in a steam locomotive cab. The cabs were a lot more open. There's a lot more air through them. The boiler isn't as hot. All these other factors that may mitigate that. But I still wouldn't want to be wearing all those things inside of the cab. There's a reason that it went away. But for railroaders, and there are a few examples and a few pictures that they have of people in the 1870s, 1880s, basically wearing nice clothes as their uniform. There was no badge or mark that said that you were the conductor, in so much as, it was I represent this railroad, let me introduce myself. Because, it was more about impressing the public that was riding your train. You wanted to show how crisp and how smart you were. Eventually, they moved on to actually issuing uniforms or telling you that you needed to buy a uniform that met their standards. They got put into rule books and all this other stuff. But for John Railroadson, this might be perfectly acceptable for railroads of the day, where, I got a black coat. I've got, my little Colonel Sanders tie. You're doing fine, buddy. So even though it may just be a generic model that sort of claims to be something it isn't, it's probably not that far off of what the 1870s is.
We're gonna build a hump yard.
Yep.
So we're gonna hump. We're doing a candid intro today. Hyce.
Yeah, just straight candid. Yep.
Straight into the humping.
We're just gonna get right into the humping. We made sure that we're gonna have enough space to do all the
I
humping.
laid a really long straight track in this flat valley because it kind of seems like an awesome space to build a giant yard. Compared to the freight boat, this is massive, and I don't honestly know anything about hump yards other than the fact that they sound funny. And well, no, okay, I understand.
The only one, and we've got everything we own pretty much put in this train, including Betsy.
Yeah.
Actually,
we don't have the cursed 2-4. Oh, it's
2-4-4-4-4. Yeah, 2-4-4-4.
What happened? You'd never have an engine with drive wheels like is there isn't an engine with drive wheels, idler wheels, and then drive wheels, is there?
Someone's gonna have an example
like a 2-4-2-4,
now, but
and then would you even call it a 2-4-2-4? Because that wouldn't make sense. Like
you'd keep the order of the wheels, but you just have to know that it was weird. I'm sure that probably.
Okay, so what Hyce and K'AN are discussing is the wheel arrangement of their weird combination locomotive thing. To be considered so the white notation was developed to describe a steam locomotive and its constituent parts. There are many different formulas for it, but basically the agreed upon standard was released, I want to say it was early 1900. And basically the Americans decided that was a system that they were going to use to describe all steam locomotives, because at about 1900, all they had were steam locomotives. You saw a few petrol-powered things and a few, weird amalgamated locomotives that were other than steam-powered. But for the most part, you had steam locomotives. If you want to know more about the white system, I just recommend you read the Wikipedia article on it. It is more than enough to fill you in on all the nuances that white notation has. But the white notation typically only calls out for single locomotives, as in locomotives that share a common frame. It doesn't include tenders, because those are considered separate cars for it. For instance, if you had a separate tender and then you had like 2 additional tenders after it, white notation doesn't cover that. White notation only covers the locomotive chassis itself. And that so in this configuration, let's assume that Montezuma and the Porter were combined into a single chassis. They did have locomotives that were like this, that had 2 separate boilers and had 2 separate driving gear. Most of them usually operated in tandem. There were, of course, a few strange oddballs out there. The McCloud River Railroad, the original one, had a weird locomotive that Baldwin built that was basically two 262s, I believe. And basically all Baldwin did was build a 262, had it face one direction, and then they built another 262, and then they pinned them together in the middle. And so you had two locomotives that sort of faced different directions, and it never worked out quite as well as they expected it to. And the only way that they could solve the problem was by basically, it's probably the most sensible thing you could do with something crazy like that. But they shared a common frame. In this case, Montezuma and Porter are separated by a tender, which is considered a non-frame component of a locomotive. And so technically you would have to classify these as 2 different locomotives. You would have a 240. Here, I can write it on a thing and I can show it to you. So Montezuma is a 240 locomotive, and the Porter is an 040 locomotive. And the other thing that you need to remember about white notation is that the pilot wheels always go first, the driving wheels always go second, and then the pony wheels always come third. The time that this changes is if you have an articulated locomotive, which is 2 sets of driving wheels on an articulated frame, but the boiler and the locomotive has a singular frame. So let's look at Hyce and kAN's weird amalgamated locomotive, assuming that it was all in the same frame. What you have is Montezuma, which is a 240 locomotive. You consider the locomotive frame in between, which would be a plus. And the tender, of course, doesn't have any driving wheels. But this is a split tender with 2 different axle boxes. I'm really tempted to consider this a 202. Yeah, because it doesn't have any driving wheels, so it would be a 202. And then we add on the Porter, which is a 040. Wow, that's a lot. So the weird amalgamated unit that Hyce and kAN are running is a 240 plus 202 plus 040. So they really have a strange locomotive there, and I don't think anybody will be picking that locomotive up anytime soon as their daily driver. Let's get back to the episode.
Probably existed in some equivalent somehow.
Capacity.
Now we need to run to the other side of the yard, and I'm debating it may actually be faster to teleport and then run the other way.
Yeah, I'm gonna put a telegraph.
Race
at the hump.
Race you.
Okay, you can race. I'm gonna put a telegraph like right at the hump because that kind of makes sense to have one.
Yeah, for sure.
Right where you're humping.
You need to make sure
Yeah,
you can get back.
You
to
don't
where
realize
can
how
hump.
far
Yeah.
this yard is. Then you realize we're actually like at the roundhouse location. We're halfway to the oil
Dude,
field. So this
like
yard is insane.
real train facilities get so big so fast. Just at my shop, the entrance to the shop was controlled by an electronic derail device, so that we couldn't accidentally run out onto the main, and the guys from the main, if the switch is lying the wrong way, wouldn't actually run into the shop and all that stuff. And
how does an electronic derail device work? You just put like a stopper up in the track or
It's
something?
got a little derail clamp that comes over the rail and would knock any wheels off, and it's operated by a switch machine.
So it just flips the train.
I mean, it wouldn't flip the train, but it would put it in the dirt, yeah. But when you're talking about accidentally running into buildings and people and dudes that are working on stuff,
it's better to put a train in the dirt.
It's better to put the train in the dirt than to, harm all sorts of people. So, it was protected by that derail, and that derail, if it failed or the electronics on it would break, you'd have to go operate it manually. And it was so far away. You went on a journey to go get to the south derail at Interbay. I mean, it was like, good God, man. I don't know the exact distance. It was over 1 kilometer from the office, I would have to bet. And it would take you forever to get there. It was obnoxious.
All right, here we go. I put a
That's an amusing story from Hyce. But to emphasize and put some more context on it, yeah, rail facilities are absolutely massive, especially when you get into the diesel era, where trains just become longer and longer and longer, and you eventually end up with what we have today, which is absolutely massive, like 200-car trains that are over a 1.5 miles in length. I mean, they're just absolutely massive. The SP ran a number of hump yards. I guess the most famous of which is the West Colton hump yard, which continues to be one of the largest in service anywhere in the United States. And actually, there's a fairly complete description of it in one of my books. Here we have the Los Angeles division, which is in a series of books written by John R. Singer. And he's probably one of the most knowledgeable people in the community that, writes books. And this one is very thick. This is also a very expensive book. So if you have the time and you have the money, I recommend picking up a copy just because this is one of the newest and most detailed volumes out there. And there's a section on the West Colton Yard in here. There's a section here starting on page 525. I'm not going to read it verbatim just because copyright and that sort of stuff, and I'm also not going to be showing you the book, but I will read out a few facts that, sort of put how big railroad infrastructure is into perspective, especially modern railroad infrastructure. West Colton Yard was designed in 1968, and it took 4 years to build. So 1972, I think, was the first time that they actually used the yard. And so here's a brief section on it. As designed, the new super yard would occupy 560 acres. And I'll convert that into kilometers just because I want everybody to have an understanding of how massive that is. And it encompasses 94 miles of track with a capacity of 6,800 cars. There are going to be 308 switches and 8 receiving and 14 departure tracks. The main classification bowl would include 48 tracks with room for 24 more if the need arose. So, just massive. I mean, it's 560 acres is enough for a small town, let alone a place where you would put trains together and pull them apart. And, large railroad companies needed it just because they were handling so much freight traffic. The Southern Pacific in Southern California is handling a lot of, container ships coming from Asia and other places in the East. Absolutely massive infrastructure to handle all the traffic that was coming over on boats, that was going through Los Angeles, that was heading north, that was heading east, that was heading, northeast, that was heading south. They interchanged down with Mexican railroads as well. And so the Southern Pacific just had huge volumes of traffic that went through this yard. So let's see, what else there is, and maybe there's more context to give in this video.
Telegraph down. I had to face it the right way.
Well, I've got the Tahobro and trussed up the fire, and now I'm running into the inbound-outbound track, and we're going to grab the cars from the rear here, and then we're going to hump them.
Right. So now,
yeah.
if this is where this is where things kind of don't make sense to me. So you're going to grab all these and pull them backwards, but I got to put your probe up.
Yep, you gotta get me ready to hump.
But
yes.
What if this caboose was something you weren't allowed to hump?
Yeah, so this would have to be set out typically, and a caboose would technically not be something that we'd hump.
Would you set this out that you would grab this right now and then just push it onto the main or something, or you'd have another line to put it on?
With our setup, yeah, you'd have to put it on the main basically, but yeah, you'd usually have like multiple inbound tracks like this, so you could stash stuff that couldn't be humped for whatever reason.
And then just bring it all the way to the end where it meets back up with the...
It would be added on the flat switch end, right? With a caboose, I mean, that's a little bit different because the era of cabooses and humps, for their prolificness, did not necessarily overlap. Yes, we still have cabooses, and they occasionally see service. And we have more humps now, and there were some rare humps early on, but the caboose would usually be added on at the end. But for other cars that needed to be set out... You just set them back over, and rather when you got to them, right? You'd be at the base of the hump and stick them out.
So in this, you would have to pull the caboose out, put it on the main, hump the entire train, and then grab the caboose and push it somewhere.
Yeah, and realistically, we probably should have added another lane, but I didn't think of that in the moment. So, and it doesn't really matter for Railroads Online because there's nothing that we can't
so
hump.
Quickly. It's yeah.
Yeah. So to quickly press upon the idea that cabooses and hump yards didn't overlap, that's not actually quite correct. It's true that there are some very early hump yards, 1930s, 1920s, but for the most part, hump yards didn't exist in the steam era. And one of the primary reasons for that is that you have very limited capacity to communicate with the engine that's actually doing the hump yard duties. And so it wasn't until railroads invested in radios and really got radio technology down that you saw hump yards become much more of a thing. And at the same time, you had a number of other technological developments that helped, spur in this change. Not quite computers in the way that we're thinking about them, but centralized control towers. Basically, if you've seen a hump yard, a modern hump yard, they have something that looks like an airport control tower on it. And it does something similar, which is they're controlling traffic. They're making sure that, cars go in the specific lanes that they're supposed to go into. And they have a lot of centralized control hardware in there that wasn't particularly practical in the steam railroading days. You had much better relay technology, among other things, signaling technology and communications technology, because everybody needs to be on, basically, they need to be on the same task at the same time, and they need to be able to talk to each other when things happen. It's possible to do it in the days of, here's a list, go ahead and switch all these things and do all these things, and we just need to coordinate really well. But when you're able to communicate in real time, it becomes much easier. So radios become a thing in the diesel era. The diesels themselves are much more capable of running at slow speeds consistently. They actually produce special hump yard locomotives that have basically good performance at slow speeds, and they have little knobs in them that you can turn that adjusts your speeds at very low RPMs. Typically, when you're running a diesel locomotive, you have 8 notches that control how much power is getting put onto the wheels. And on hump yard locomotives, you need a little bit more refinement than that, because you're trying to run at, like 4 miles an hour or maybe 4.5 miles an hour. And if you had just 8 notches, then you'd constantly be having to switch back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to try and find the speed that works for you. So that's a quick side about diesel hump yard locomotives. But it's it was really dieselization that brought forward this thing. And so about the 1950s is when it started. But you still had cabooses. In fact, they continued to be a regulatory requirement until the 1970s, I believe, which is a long time to have caboose in the United States. There are still debates going on to this day of whether or not cabooses are necessary on modern trains, because they're trying to cut crew sizes again to save more money, because the human factor is probably what costs the most on the railroad. And so they're cutting down on maintenance, they're cutting down on crew shops, all these things. And I'm not here to get involved in that sort of stuff. I'm just here to tell you that the cabooses and the hump yards overlap by about 20 years, which is a good amount of time that they would have to swap out the caboose, put her on an outbound line without the rest of the consist there. So they did overlap.
I have no idea. I wonder if we can fit the whole train over the hump.
I was looking when we were coming around the corner, and it was close, but I felt like we could.
Okay, well, you can see all
This would
the
be a
cars.
good
I can't.
test of
So
yeah.
and that's all the switches. It's great. This turned out so cool. I'm glad this idea worked.
Yeah, this is ridiculous. But now we can hump empties and then pick them up, reassemble our trains, and then leave. Have our roundos at the other end. I'll probably.
Okay, ridiculous is right. There's actually a reason that narrow gauge railroads never did this. Primarily because they didn't have enough rolling stock or enough destinations to warrant the need to, reclassify things in yards. If you think of, really big railroad corporations, let's say the Southern Pacific, for example, just because I know it so well. You have trains that are going all the way to Oregon. You have trains that are heading east through Louisiana. You have trains that are heading northeast. You have trains that are heading everywhere. And how do you, switch the cars around in order to assemble them in a way that makes sense? Because when you go into Los Angeles to pick up a whole bunch of freight cars, like heavy freight cars, they're going to have different destinations. If you're a furniture company, maybe you've made a few dozen sales to somebody in San Francisco, or maybe you've made a few 100 sales to somebody in Texas. How do you get those things to where you need to go? Because you're picking up both freight cars at the same time, but they're going to two completely different places. So you need to figure some place to put them. And so hump yards were really the place where mainline railroads, the ones that had multiple destinations that went from major city to major city, and they had, branching tracks that needed to go in both directions at basically the same time. And so, that's really where the hump yard found its fame. And for small railroads, especially like insular sort of railroads, you have one main line of track for the most part. And everything is basically going from one end of the train line to the other end of the train line. And you wouldn't want to invest in making something this big and complicated to try and do that sort of thing. The other thing that I think is sort of unrealistic, and why hump yards really didn't exist in the narrow gauge era that Railroads Online has, is Lincoln pin couplers. Really, the only thing that makes hump yards safe is the fact that we have, the standard AAR couplers, the knuckle couplers that connect and disconnect, so that you can come in and couple, make a good joint, and then when you want to unpin them, you can release one side and then they slip apart. And in the Lincoln pin era, you really don't have that. You need somebody physically standing there with a link trying to connect cars. And there's no way that would work with a hump yard like this, because then you would need somebody standing by between the two cars. So just imagine you're standing there at the end of a train that's being assembled, and then this freight car comes barreling at you at a few dozen miles an hour. It's got to be absolutely terrifying, because your job as the brakeman, as the person putting the train together, is to take this pin and hold it up in a position where when the next freight car comes in, it actually picks up the link so you can slide the pin in. And yeah, that's not going to go well. You're not going to have a fun time. You're going to very likely break all your hands and break yourself, because what you would need to do if you didn't do that is you would need to stretch the cars just enough that you can put a link in, you can put a pin in, and then you need to bring the train back together to put the other pin in. And depending on how far away your locomotive is and how well they can see you, this becomes a very difficult operation. And so I think it's unrealistic that you would ever need or create something like this. It's basically pure fantasy. But hey, now Hyce and kAN get to do something that nobody's ever done in narrow gauge history. So, I guess it's cool looking, but in terms of historical accuracy, that ain't happening.
Yeah, well, I guess when we do the Roundhouse episode, we'll have to move like all the fuel and stuff. I put a water tower there, but we'll have to move.
Well, thank you for coming with me on this journey for part 3. I hope to see you again for part 4, where I react to more of Hyce and kAN's Railroads Online content. I know that the next episode in this series is a little bit more content heavy than this one was, but I hope that you'll continue to follow me as I do those sorts of things. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.